At the age of 26, in 1955, Martin Luther King Jr. accepted the call to be minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama. I had the privilege of visiting that church some years ago and standing in this pulpit. It was inspiring. But shortly after he went to that church, Rosa Parks made her heroic stand against the bus company. And the Montgomery Improvement Organization was formed in the Black community in order to challenge the segregation of the buses. A boycott was launched with the Black community saying, in effect, we will not use this unjust bus system. And so 20,000 people were involved in carpooling. Well, early on, Martin Luther King was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And I often wonder, well, why did that happen? Theories abound. Vernon Johns, his predecessor, had been very active in social justice issues. Perhaps the fact that he was just completing his doctorate at Boston University in social ethics with a strong component of philosophical theory gave him stature. I've always been interested in the fact that his doctoral dissertation had to do with comparing and contrasting the theologies of Unitarian Henry Nelson Wyman and the theology of Luther and Paul Tillich. Some say that he was the new kid on the block who wasn't identified with any existing factions. But anyway, he accepted the challenge of leadership, but right away, it got very tough. There were threatening phone calls at all hours of the day and night. He was arrested and jailed for a time on a major minor traffic infraction. He was to be arrested and jailed 29 more times in his career. There were many difficult differences of opinion within the Black community. And so he began to think of ways that he could gracefully withdraw from leadership without appearing to be a coward. And one day he was praying about this aloud of how he could deal with this debacle when, as he explained it, the divine came to him in a way that he had never experienced it before. A voice deep within inside him said, "Go forward, despite your fears and all of the confusion." So for the next almost 14 years, he followed that voice despite his fears. The short time after that spiritual experience, his house was bombed. He was speaking at an MIA meeting, and his wife and 10-week-old daughter were in the house when it was bombed. A good portion of the house was destroyed, but fortunately, his wife and child were not injured. He ran to his house, and there was a whole group of people there, many of them armed, wanting to launch a retaliatory strike. But his nonviolent philosophy was strong, and he said no. Both sets of parents of Martin and Coretta urged them to leave Montgomery, and Daddy King said, "It's better to be a live dog than a dead lion." But they stayed in that community, and his house was bombed again a second time before the boycott ended, when it was finally declared unconstitutional by court order in 1956. But that boycott lasted 385 days. Imagine that, 20,000 people carpooling each workday. So for the next 14 years, he challenged his fears again and again. In Harlem in 1958, he was signing his book in a department store when a distraught woman came up and plunged a letter opener blade into his chest. And for several hours, there was a debate among doctors about how to take it out without piercing his aorta. And through some intricate surgery, his life was saved. And many times later, he said, "If I had sneezed, I would have died." A short time later, at a Southern Christian Leadership Conference meeting in Birmingham, he was speaking to supporters when a man ran out of the crowd to the podium and started to attack him with his fists. King did not retaliate. He kept his arms at his side. Others wrestled the man to the floor. It turns out he was a member of the American Nazi Party. King refused to press charges. I was attending college in Chicago in the early to mid 60s and was impressed with his courage when he led a march for equal housing opportunities through Gage Park. And there were screaming people throwing rocks at him, and a rock hit him in the head and he fell to the ground. That blow in itself could have been fatal. But we know how he led the march in Birmingham against Old Connors and his dogs and spent 8 days in jail then. And then he led the march from Selma to Montgomery, where in that desolate area, a sniper could have easily picked him off as he led that march. I think it's important to realize that 1/4 of all Unitarian Universalist ministers were on that march with him. But he was a man of courage, willing to put his life on the line, literally hundreds of times, of course. We know that his life was finally taken when in Memphis, he was helping the garbage workers who were on strike and was shot to death on April 4th, 1968. The morning or the day after he had made "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech. But he, more than any other person, I believe, was responsible for the civil rights revolution in our country. Now, Martin Luther King, I think, meets Aristotle's definition of courage well. Courage involves someone having a noble goal and then having the ability to challenge his or her fear and meeting that goal, moderating their fear when appropriate. In his autobiography, Ralph Abernathy, King's close associate, describes King as demonstrating Aristotle's point. The courageous person does not obliterate fear, but operates despite fear. Abernathy tells us that before major confrontations, King became violently ill, not just an upset stomach, but sweating profusely. And he said it reminded him of that account of Jesus sweating, as it were, great drops of blood in Gethsemane before he was arrested. He said that Martin would go through agonies of soul, fear, and terror. And he would, on occasion, share his moodiness and fear with his close associates. At times, he would say how he would like to retire to a farm in Georgia and leave the struggle behind. But of course, that voice within him kept urging him onward. Well, in this Martin Luther King Sunday, I want to pose the question, what does his legacy of courage say to us today? Well, it poses to me an important question. What would I be willing to die for? Have you ever asked yourself that question? When the rubber hits the road, that is the ultimate question, is it not? Now, I can imagine that I would be willing to lay down my life in protection of my family. I remember one time after my son was just days old, and we were visiting someone on New Year's Day, and I was carrying him out of the house at the end of the party in one of those carriers and started down a steep flight of stairs. And I stumbled at the top, and I still managed to hold him without, of course, putting out my hands to break my fall until I was able to safely, deliver him to the end of the stairs. But I thought of that. There was no question whatever. I was willing to sacrifice in order to save that precious life. But when it comes to my family, how willing would I be able to take a stand that might be very harmful to them? I remember reading about a woman ministerial colleague, a UU, who stood out for the rights of gays and lesbians in her community. And then the threatening phone calls started, and her children were threatened and ridiculed at school. Would I do the same? Aristotle had the idea of the golden mean in terms of any virtue. And with courage, on one end of the continuum was brashness, which would be being overly courageous, and on the other end was cowardice. And he suggested there's a golden mean in between. And I think I would be pretty sure to seek that golden mean if the well-being of my children and family were involved. But I can think of one example where I stood out for courage. When I was working for the UU Washington office for 6 months after my seminary years, I worked very diligently on a project of the National Coalition to Ban Handguns. And we planned a major march around the Capitol in Washington after we had a news conference of people who had lost loved ones to handgun violence. And I had worked very hard on getting local UUs from all the churches in Washington, D.C. to come and join us in this march. And Jack Corbett, who was president of the organization, said, "Paul, you've worked so hard on this. We want you to have the honor of carrying our banner at the front of this march." Oh my gosh, I had had threatening phone calls coming to my office about this march. And was I willing to take that chance? All it would take would be one gun nut. And certainly that nut would want to take out the person who was leading the march with the organization banner. But I think possibly because I didn't want to appear to be a coward, similar to the situation that Martin Luther King found himself in, I agreed to do it. But that was one case where I really thought, this might be an issue of my life being at stake. But short of my life being at stake, what degree am I willing to stand up for basic human rights and dignity? The sorts of questions that all of us face from time to time. My favorite preacher of all time was Fred Craddock, who was professor of preaching at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta for many years. And I remember hearing him give this example in a sermon, use this sermon illustration. When he was studying for his doctoral prelims at Vanderbilt University, he would sometimes go late at night to a local Greasy Spoon restaurant. And he was there one night, and he ordered his toasted cheese sandwich and had eaten the sandwich and was on his second cup of coffee when finally a waiter waited on an elderly Black person who had been waiting that whole time. The waiter got up and took a dried up piece of hamburger from the back of the grill and gave it to the man. He wouldn't allow the man to sit in the diner. He had to go out and eat it at the curb. He was given no condiments. Craddock said the debris thrown up by passing 18-wheelers on that road were his condiments. Craddock said, "I felt bad about it, but I didn't say anything. I felt terrible. Part of me saw what was going on, but I didn't say a word. And as I left the diner that night, I heard a cock crow 3 times. I've often wondered, after thinking about this example given in his sermon, why didn't he go back and express his displeasure to the waiter at the diner? Maybe say, "I'm not going to buy my nighttime snacks here any longer because of this behavior," but he didn't. But how many times might we have failed? I think of a time many years ago now when I was called late at night by a policeman who said, "I'm at the community hall, which is owned by your church, and it hasn't been locked, and I think you should come and lock it." So I went into town and I locked up the community hall. And while I was doing that, a group of teenagers drove up to the stop sign, and he apparently had some sort of bone to pick with them, and he swore at them. He called them vile names. He screamed at them, and I was shocked because I knew this fellow. He had been very, very kind to me. In fact, he had let me off the hook one time when I hadn't put my new tags on my license in proper timely fashion, and just given me a warning. And I had seen him around town a good deal, and I felt I should say something, but I didn't say anything. A member of my congregation was on the town council. I could have shared it with him, but I didn't do it. It takes a good deal of gumption and courage to challenge a policeman who you're going to be seeing often in the community, who does have some sort of power over you. And if I could go back, I would do that very, very much differently. I remember in one of my congregations, a fellow said that he was on the board of a small manufacturing company, and he had just come back from a board meeting where the CEO had told a very derisive joke about African Americans. And he said, I didn't challenge him right at that meeting, but later he said, I sent him a letter and told him how this certainly was not a good thing to do, and was despicable. And of course, you're kind of taking the chance and doing something like that. But the CEO wrote him back and said, you're right. That was not a good thing to do, and I will never do that again. If we take a stand sometimes, we can have an effect. My brother Phil, who died 4 years ago, was gay, and many times over the years, I shouldn't say many times, but there have been occasions when I've been with people who made slurs about gay people or told gay jokes, which were very, very degrading. And I could say to them, well, this hasn't been my experience with my brother Phil, and I really take exception to the way you are treating such folks by what you're saying. It takes a bit of courage, but how often are we willing to take that chance to stand up? And as a congregation too, how often are we willing to take up the case of people who are discriminated against because of sexual orientation, gender, race, physical abilities, religion, or any number of other categories? One of my congregations put up a Black Lives Matter sign, of course, which was taken down and vandalized. And then something was vandalized on church grounds. The water sprinkling system was torn up. But they felt it was a necessary thing to do to show to the community our values. After the last the election in 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center said that in the 10 days following the election of President Trump, there were almost 900 cases of harassment and intimidation from across the nation. Of course, they kept track over the past 4 years. There's been a remarkable uptick in such white supremacist activity. And certainly it is our important aspect as Unitarian Universalists to stand out against this. And I think one of the most effective ways is by joining in coalition with other congregations, as we have in Jacksonville with the I Care organization, which is ecumenical and brings together many organizations with similar commitments and values. And when I served the Stewart congregation in recent years, of course, we were part of the Faith in Florida group, and we organized a march after George Floyd's death, which brought hundreds of people together to show to the community that we stood against such police violence. But to speak out forcefully on all forms of violence and bigotry, I think is part of the legacy of King on this day celebrating his life. But then I think it's also important in our personal lives to challenge fears which stand in the way of really fully living. And in the course of my ministry, of course, I've come across many of these with folks. I remember a woman once who came to me, she said, I really have a problem with flying. And my husband has won several awards for trips to Hawaii and other parts of the country, which we haven't been able to take advantage of because I'm so fearful I can't get in an airplane, because the minute that door closes, I get claustrophobic feelings and I have to leave. I can't stand it. What can I do? Well, this kind of bothered me because I'm claustrophobic too. And when she explained this to me, I was feeling a little claustrophobic. But, I suggested to her, I've heard of systematic desensitization as a therapy mechanism, and I referred her to someone who could help her with this because I'd had trouble with claustrophobia for my whole adult life due to experiences when I was a kid. I remember one time when I was quite young, older kids in the neighborhood had dug a hole and put me in it and then put some heavy things on top. So I was stuck in the ground and couldn't get out. And ever since then, I think that's the reason why I've had this fear of being closed in tight spaces. Thankfully, someone heard my cries for help, came and rescued me. But I realize if I don't challenge my fears about elevators, I'm doing a lot of walking up of a lot of flights of stairs. And my phobia was really challenged at a UA General Assembly in Fort Worth a number of years ago, where I was trapped in an elevator with many other people for 45 minutes. And the way I dealt with that was by deliberate breathing and trying to put my mind at other things. And I was able to challenge that panic. But I think it's so important to challenge our fears to see if they are realistic and to operate in spite of them. A very important lesson for me was when I was a college student. I took a job as a night man in a funeral home. I did that over one summer because it gave me a place to stay, and I was able to take some summer school classes so I could graduate from college a bit early. But I remember the first night I was in this funeral home, and we had a busy situation. We had 2 cases on. There were bodies on either side of me of this small office in which I was trying to get to sleep. And the smell of flowers suffused the air. And in the middle of the night, I began to have what I now realize was a panic attack. I was breathing heavily. I couldn't sleep. And I'll tell you, when my boss came in at 7 in the morning, I was so glad to get out of there. But I realized, can I go back tonight and go through this again? And, I spent that whole day in the library reading about fear. Now, fear has a very important role to play in our lives in terms of survival, but so often it can be misplaced, and it can be, lead us to unrealistic fears. And so during that whole day reading about fear, I talked myself into the fact that being in a funeral home in the city of Chicago was probably the safest place I could be in that city of Chicago. And I went back to the preparation room, and they did some autopsies there, apparently. And there were all these surgical instruments, sharp knives and saws and everything. I said, boy, if anyone breaks in and tries to take me by surprise, I've got all of these instruments to protect me. Well, I went back to work that night. I slept through the whole night and was able to manage that whole summer in terms of the plans I had made. Now, I wasn't particularly happy always being there, especially when police brought bodies in at night that I had to attend to. But I was able to do it because I challenged my fear. For 3 years, I took classes and group process with the guru of church systems theory, Rabbi Ed Friedman. And he said to us, you should never, ever give in to fears within the system in which you're expressing leadership. He said you should always have your bags packed and ready to go and not give in to threats in terms of your ability to speak freely and to act freely as a minister within the context, of course, of ministerial ethics and the traditions of congregation. But that really came in handy for me in one of my congregations, where this only has happened once in my nearly 46 years as a minister. I became very much in conflict with the president of the congregation, who threatened to call a meeting to fire me and my tenure. principally, he wanted me to give him my sermons in advance before I gave them, so that he had another person they were going to give me counsel as to what the type of sermons and what I should say. And I said, no, absolutely not. I won't do that. I said, I will be open to comment afterwards and, counsel as to how effective the sermon was or what I might do in the future, but I'm not going to give you my sermons ahead of time. And he said, well, I think we're going to have a vote on your tenure. And I said, I never want you to threaten me with that. All you have to do, according to the bylaws, is get 30 people to sign the petition, and you can have a congregational meeting to get rid of me. But I never want you to threaten me again. I did that in the presence of a member of the Committee on Ministry, or the Ministerial Relations Committee. Of course, he continued to try to do it, and I just wouldn't listen to him. Now, in part, I didn't think he could get the 30 signatures. But more importantly, my wife was working. I had put enough money aside that I knew our family would not be destitute, that we could pay the mortgage and put food on the table and continue on until I could get a new position. So that was so important. That was one of the aspects of the things that Rabbi Edwin Friedman didn't bring out. He said, make sure you have enough resources so that you don't have to put up with that sort of tyranny. But so often, our fears may be unfounded. And it helps to get the counsel and advice and suggestion and experience of other people and helping us deal with our fears. Peter Drucker, of course, is known as the guru of business management. He has written 18 books on that subject. At age 72, he came out with his first novel. It's not considered the best of all his works, but he was asked by a critic, well, why did you not attempt a novel earlier in your career? He said, I was afraid to do it. A novel is the greatest test of a writer's skill. But when I became 70, I didn't much care what people thought of me. And so I went ahead and he said, in fact, I'm working on my second novel right now. So on this Martin Luther King Sunday, I suggest that we review our lives in terms of our fear. What are we willing to put ourselves out for, and perhaps bear opprobrium, maybe even some danger in pursuit of our highest values in terms of human dignity? And are we willing to challenge those fears, which may not have a basis in reality, to live more fulfilling lives? So let's take heed of Martin Luther King's words to build dikes of courage to hold back the flood of fear. I'm also much impressed with the counsel given to us by the great Goethe. He said, the moment one definitely commits oneself, the providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help. A whole stream of events issues from that decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meanings and assistance. Whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. So may it be. Amen.